The basement door creaked as I descended the wooden stairs, each step echoing like a countdown to my invisibility. My daughter Rebecca stood at the top, silhouetted against the warm kitchen light, her manicured hand resting on the doorframe. "Mom, you understand, right? With Tom's parents coming and the kids needing their rooms, this is just the most practical solution." Her voice carried that practiced patience she used with difficult clients at her law firm. I understood perfectly. I understood that after raising her for 32 years, I had been downgraded to storage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The basement smelled of old cardboard and forgotten winters. A narrow cot had been wedged between the water heater and a tower of plastic bins labeled Xmas decorations in Rebecca's precise handwriting. The same decorations I used to spend hours arranging while she danced around my feet, begging to place the angel on top of the tree. Now I was being stored alongside them, another seasonal item to be tucked away when more important guests arrived. I set my small overnight bag on the concrete floor and smiled up at her. The same smile I had perfected over years of swallowing disappointments. "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever works best for everyone." She nodded, relief washing over her features, and disappeared back into the warmth above. The door clicked shut, and I was left with the hum of the furnace and the weight of my secrets pressing against my ribs. If only she knew what I had hidden all these years. If only she knew who her mother really was beneath the secondhand clothes and quiet acceptance. My name is Nancy Wilson, though these days few people call me anything at all. At 73, I have learned that age makes you transparent, like tissue paper held up to the light. People see through you to whatever matters more on the other side. But I wasn't always invisible. There was a time when my presence filled rooms, when my decisions shaped futures, when my signature alone could move mountains of money. That woman still lives inside me, patient as a seed waiting for spring. The transformation from somebody to nobody didn't happen overnight. It was a slow fade, like watching the sun sink below the horizon, so gradual you don't realize you're sitting in darkness until you can no longer see your own hands. It started 15 years ago when my husband Gerald died. One day I was Mrs. Wilson, wife of the prominent investor, hostess of charity galas, the woman whose opinion mattered at country club brunches. The next day I was simply Nancy, the widow who needed to downsize, who couldn't possibly manage that big house alone, who should probably start thinking about her future care needs. Rebecca swooped in with spreadsheets and sensible shoes, full of plans for my own good. "Mom, you don't need 5 bedrooms. Think of the maintenance. Think of the stairs." She spoke as if I hadn't been managing that house for 40 years, as if I hadn't raised 3 children within those walls while Gerald traveled for business, as if I hadn't kept every corner gleaming for his important dinners. But widows, I learned, are expected to shrink, to take up less space, to be grateful for whatever corner their children carve out for them. So I sold the house in Westfield, not because I needed to, though Rebecca never asked about my finances. She simply assumed that without Gerald, I was barely scraping by. The truth would have sent her reeling, but I kept it locked away like a card player holding a royal flush while everyone assumes you're bluffing with nothing. The sale brought in $3 million, which I quietly added to the portfolio nobody knew existed. The portfolio Gerald had taught me to manage long before women were supposed to understand such things. The portfolio that had grown under my careful attention like a garden, tended in secret. Rebecca found me a tidy 1-bedroom apartment in a senior living community called Sunshine Gardens, though I never saw much sunshine there. The residents shuffled through hallways that smelled of industrial cleaning supplies and loneliness. They gathered in the recreation room to play cards with fading eyesight and pretend their children visited more than they did. I lasted 6 months, before I couldn't bear another game of bridge with Margaret, who repeated the same stories about her grandson every single day, forgetting she had told them an hour before. When I mentioned wanting to find somewhere else to live, Rebecca's face tightened the way it did when she was preparing for court. "Mom, be reasonable. Sunshine Gardens has medical staff on site. They have activities. They have people your age, people my age." As if reaching 70 meant I only wanted to associate with others who remembered the same presidents. As if age was a disease that needed to be quarantined. I suggested perhaps a small house, something with a garden where I could grow tomatoes like I used to. She laughed, but not kindly. "Mom, you can barely manage your apartment. How would you handle a whole house?" I wanted to tell her about the investment properties I owned in 3 states, about the technology stocks I had bought when everyone said the internet was a fad, about the Swiss account Gerald had opened, in my name for security, which I had nurtured into a small fortune through careful currency trades. Instead, I stirred my coffee and changed the subject to her children, which always softened her edges. The truth was, I could have bought Sunshine Gardens outright and turned it into whatever I wanted. I could have purchased a mansion that would make our old Westfield house look modest. But money, I had learned, was like a weapon. Once you showed it, you could never put it away again. And I wasn't ready for Rebecca to see me differently. Not yet. I still hoped she might remember who I had been to her without needing proof of my worth in dollar signs. So I moved again, this time to a converted garage apartment behind the house of a young couple who needed help with their mortgage. Rebecca approved because it was even cheaper than Sunshine Gardens, and came with the built-in narrative that I was helping out, rather than needing help myself. The apartment was clean and quiet, with a little window that looked out onto their vegetable garden. I paid my modest rent on time, kept to myself, and let everyone believe what they wanted to believe about Nancy Wilson, the sweet old lady who used to be somebody's wife. My son Marcus lived in Seattle, running a tech startup that always seemed on the verge of either breakthrough or bankruptcy. He called on my birthday and Christmas, conversations full of rushing and distraction. "Hey, Mom, can't talk long, but..." wanted to check in. 5 minutes later, he was gone, back to his important life where mothers were peripheral figures who existed mainly in the past tense. My youngest, Diana, had married a diplomat and lived in Brussels. She sent expensive chocolates on holidays and photos of her travels to places I would never see. "You should get Facebook, Mom," she always said. "Then you could see all my pictures." As if looking at her life through a screen could substitute for being part of it. But Rebecca was the one who hurt the most, because Rebecca was the one who had needed me most. When her father died, she was the only one who came home, who sat with me through the funeral arrangements, who held my hand during the service. For a brief moment, I thought I had my daughter back. The girl who used to crawl into my lap with skinned knees and broken hearts, trusting that I could fix anything. But grief, I learned, has an expiration date in the modern world. After a month, maybe 2, you're expected to move on, to stop bringing down the mood, to be grateful for what you had instead of mourning what you lost. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca's husband Tom never warmed to me. From the beginning, he looked at me the way people look at furniture they inherited, but don't particularly like. Obligatory. Taking up space, not matching the decor. He was a cardiac surgeon with hands that saved lives and eyes that calculated the value of everything they saw. When they visited my garage apartment that first time, I watched him catalog its deficiencies, the old appliances, the worn carpet, the tiny bathroom with its dated fixtures. I saw him exchange glances with Rebecca, silent conversations about how long this arrangement would last, how much I might need from them in the future. Their children, my grandchildren, barely knew me. Sophia was 16, all legs and attitude, permanently attached to her phone. Brandon, at 14, communicated mainly in grunts and shoulder shrugs. The little one, Emma, just 8, still had moments of warmth, but they were growing rare. To them, I was Grandma Nancy, the one who lived in the small apartment, who gave them $20 on birthdays, who they had to hug hello and goodbye at family gatherings. Not the woman who had once run charity auctions that raised millions. Not the woman who had advised Gerald on investments that funded their parents' education. Just Grandma Nancy, furniture that breathed. The holidays were the worst. That's when families were supposed to come together, when the marketing promised warmth and connection and multi-generational joy around beautifully set tables. The first year after Gerald died, I hosted Thanksgiving in my apartment. I cooked for 2 days, cramming a feast into my tiny kitchen, setting up a folding table in the living room. Rebecca arrived late, stressed about traffic. Tom barely ate, claiming he was watching his cholesterol. The kids picked at their phones more than their plates. They left after exactly 2 hours, Rebecca kissing my cheek and promising they'd stay longer at Christmas. They didn't. After that, holidays became something that happened to me rather than with me. Easter at Rebecca's, where I sat at the end of the table and passed dishes. 4th of July at Tom's parents' lake house, where I dozed in a lawn chair while everyone else water skied. Christmas was the elaborate production where my presence was both required and inconvenient, like a prop that had to be included, but kept getting in the way of the real action. It was Tom's mother, Eleanor, who first suggested the basement. 2. Christmases ago, casually, as if mentioning the weather. You know, when my aunt used to visit, she actually preferred the basement. So quiet and private down there. She had looked at me over her wine glass, her smile sharp as tinsel. Rebecca had flushed, stammered something about the guest room, but I saw her considering it. Saw her weigh her mother-in-law's comfort against mine and find mine lighter. I knew then that I had become a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cherished. The mother who had sung her to sleep, who had stayed up all night when she had pneumonia, who had fought her elementary school principal when he said girls didn't need advanced math. That mother had been edited out, replaced by an elderly woman who needed to be managed, whose presence complicated seating charts and sleeping arrangements. Last Christmas, I slept on the couch in Tom's study, my feet hanging off the edge, my back aching by morning. Eleanor and Richard had the guest room, of course. Tom's brother's family had the basement then, which was still unfinished, just concrete and exposed beams. But this year, Rebecca had called me in October, her voice bright with forced enthusiasm. "Mom, we've fixed up the basement. It's actually quite cozy now, like a little private suite." She didn't say it would be mine for the holidays. She didn't have to. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat on that narrow cot, listening to footsteps and laughter above. If they knew about the safety deposit box downtown, heavy with bearer bonds. If they knew about the art collection in climate-controlled storage, Monet sketches and Basquiat paintings bought when nobody knew his name. If they knew about the foundation I had established under a trust, quietly funding scholarships for women returning to college after raising families. If they knew any of it, I wouldn't be in this basement. But then I would never know if their love required a price tag. Gerald used to say that money was like fire, useful when controlled, destructive when it wasn't. "Never show all your cards, Nancy," he told me during those long evenings when he taught me about markets and margins. The moment people know what you're holding, they stop seeing you and start seeing opportunities. He had been talking about business rivals then, about corporate negotiations and hostile takeovers. He never imagined I would need to hide my hand from our own daughter. But Rebecca had grown up in a different world than the one where I learned to survive. She took her advantages for granted, assumed they were birthrights rather than privileges someone else had earned. The private schools, the tennis lessons, the college tuition paid in full. She never asked how we afforded it all on Gerald's salary, never wondered why I spent evenings poring over financial statements, never noticed that I could predict market downturns with uncanny accuracy. To her, I was just mom, the background, support system that made her achievements possible. After Gerald's funeral, when the lawyers read the will, Rebecca's face had gone slack with shock. "Everything to Mom?" she had whispered, as if there must be some mistake. "The house, the investment accounts, the business holdings, all in my name." "But Mom doesn't know anything about managing money," she had said to the lawyer, right there, in front of me, as if I were already gone. The lawyer, bless him, had simply adjusted his glasses and said, "Your mother has been managing your father's portfolio for the last 20 years, Ms. Hayes. She's quite accomplished." Rebecca's revision of history began immediately. Dad must have set things up to take care of Mom. The lawyers must be guiding her. Those financial advisors must be making all the decisions. It was easier for her to believe that than to acknowledge. She had never really seen me at all. So I let her believe it. Let her think the house sale was necessary, that my downsizing was economical rather than strategic, that her aging mother needed looking after. It was a test, maybe. Or perhaps just exhaustion. I was tired of proving myself to people who should have already known my worth. The furnace kicked on with a rumble that shook the thin walls of my basement corner. Upstairs, I could hear Tom's booming laugh, the one he saved for his parents. Rebecca's heels clicked across the kitchen floor in that frantic pattern I recognized from every holiday. She was performing, orchestrating, managing everyone's experience except mine. Through the ceiling, Emma's voice piped up, asking something about cookies. My recipe, probably, though Rebecca would claim it as her own now. Another thing passed down and forgotten in the passing. I pulled my cashmere shawl tighter, the one luxury I allowed myself in this charade of poverty. Tomorrow would be Christmas Eve, and the house would fill with more family. Tom's sister and her perfect children, Rebecca's friends from the club dropping by for cocktails. Everyone would cluster in the warm spaces upstairs while I sat in this concrete box, waiting to be summoned for meals where my presence would be acknowledged just enough to avoid guilt. But I had learned patience in my 73 years. Learned that sometimes the best revelations come not from shouting the truth, but from letting lies exhaust themselves. Rebecca thought she was protecting me, managing my decline, being the responsible daughter. She had no idea she was stacking kindling for a fire that would burn through every assumption she had ever made about her mother, about power, about family, about the price of taking someone for granted. The wooden stairs creaked again. Someone was coming down. I straightened on the cot, composed my face into the pleasant, vacant expression they expected. But inside that, other Nancy smiled. The one who had built an empire while everyone thought she was just building casseroles. The one who had been watching, waiting, choosing her moment with the precision of a chess master who could see 20 moves ahead. They had put me in the basement, but they had no idea what foundations I had laid. What was coming? What had always been there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions, or the wrong ones. The footsteps stopped halfway down the stairs. I recognized the hesitation, that particular pause that meant Rebecca was second-guessing something. Her voice drifted down, careful and measured. "Mom? I'm putting fresh towels on the landing. The powder room upstairs is a bit crowded, so feel free to use the utility sink down there if you need to." The utility sink, where Tom washed paintbrushes and gardening tools. I kept my voice light, grateful even. "That's thoughtful, dear. I'll be just fine." Her footsteps retreated, and I was left staring at the industrial sink in the corner, its faucet spotted with mineral deposits. Next to it, they had placed a small mirror, the kind you might find in a gym locker room. I caught my reflection in it and almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the woman staring back at me looked exactly like what they expected to see. Gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, reading glasses on a chain, polyester blouse from a discount store, the uniform of invisible old women everywhere. What they couldn't see was the Swiss watch hidden beneath my sleeve, a vintage Patek Philippe that Gerald had given me for our 25th anniversary. Worth more than their cars combined, but small enough to pass for a Timex. They couldn't see the bank statements I had memorized and burned, the property deeds locked in safety deposit boxes across 3 states, the investment portfolio that generated more in monthly dividends than Tom made in a year. They saw what I showed them, and I had become very good at the show. The performance had started small. After moving to the garage apartment, I began shopping at thrift stores, not because I needed to, but because Rebecca would notice the bags. She'd smile that tight smile of relief when she saw the Goodwill logo, thinking her poor mother was being sensible with her limited resources. I donated my designer clothes to charity auctions in distant cities where no one would recognize them, keeping only a few quality pieces that I altered to look cheaper, letting out seams, removing labels, adding the kind of wear that suggested poverty rather than age. I learned to complain about prices at the grocery store, to clip coupons Rebecca would see in my purse, to mention waiting for sales before buying anything. When she took me to lunch, I always ordered the soup and salad combo, always asked for a box for the leftovers, always made a show of calculating the tip on my fingers. She'd reach for the check with that combination of duty and pity that had replaced whatever love used to live between us, and I'd let her, knowing the money she spent on my $12 lunch wouldn't cover the hourly interest on my offshore accounts. The game might have gone on forever if not for Eleanor. Tom's mother had the kind of cruelty that came wrapped in concern, violence dressed up as etiquette. She'd been the first to suggest I was becoming too much for Rebecca to handle. It started with small comments at family dinners. "Rebecca, you look exhausted. It must be so hard, managing everything with your mother's situation." The pause before situation was deliberate, loaded with implications about decline and burden and the natural order of things. Eleanor came from old money, the kind that built libraries and had wings of hospitals named after them. She'd married Richard for his medical career, but it was her inheritance that bought their house on the lake, their winter place in Scottsdale, their comfortable assumption that the world should bend to accommodate them. In her universe, mothers-in-law, like me, were supposed to fade gracefully into assisted living, leaving clean estates and no complications. My continued existence in Rebecca's life was an affront to her sense of how things should be. She had been testing me for years in ways she thought were subtle, asking about my fixed income with false sympathy, gifting me grocery store gift, cards for birthdays. Once, she'd even offered to help me apply for government assistance programs, sliding the brochures across her mahogany dining table with manicured fingers. "There's no shame in needing help, Nancy. We all have to adjust to our new realities." I had thanked her, taken the brochures, and used them to light the fire in my apartment's old fireplace. The flames had been particularly satisfying that night, but Eleanor's cruelest stroke was making Rebecca complicit in my erasure. She did it through 1,000 small manipulations, scheduling family photos when I couldn't attend, planning vacations that didn't include space for me. Always having a reason why this holiday, this birthday, this celebration would work better if I came for just part of it, or maybe sat this one out. "We wouldn't want to tire your mother," she'd say to Rebecca, as if I were a Victorian invalid, instead of a woman who still swam 50 laps every morning at the community center. Rebecca never saw the strategy behind it. She was too busy trying to balance everyone's needs, too exhausted from her law practice and managing 3 children and maintaining the perfect suburban life that Eleanor deemed acceptable. It was easier to believe her mother-in-law's narrative than to question it. Easier to see me as fragile than to wonder why I'd grown quiet. Easier to assume I was declining than to notice I was choosing to retreat. The basement had been Eleanor's masterstroke. She'd planted the seed 2 years ago, but she'd been patient, waiting for it to grow. First came the comments about how nice it was that Tom's brother's family could stay downstairs during their visit. Then observations about how the basement was really quite comfortable, almost like a guest suite. By the time she suggested it for me, it seemed like a practical solution to a space problem rather than what it really was: a burial. I thought about the house in Lake Geneva that sat empty 11 months of the year. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, a kitchen designed for entertaining. I'd bought it through a shell company 5 years ago, telling no one. Sometimes I drove up there, just to walk through the rooms, to remember what it felt like to take up space without apology. The neighbors thought I was the caretaker. I let them think it. Another role. Another costume in my collection of deceptions. The furnace cycled off, leaving a sudden silence that made the laughter upstairs seem louder. They were playing some kind of game. I could hear Sophia's teenage sarcasm, Brandon's competitive protests, Emma's giggles. Once, I would have been up there with them, teaching them the card games Gerald and I had played on quiet evenings. Instead, I sat on this cot like a storage problem solved, listening to my family exist without me. My phone, an old flip model that made Rebecca sigh every time she saw it, sat silent on the overturned box I was using as a nightstand. No one called anymore. Or rather, no one called this phone. The iPhone in my safety deposit box, the one linked to my real life, would be full of messages. From my financial advisor confirming the latest acquisition. From the gallery owner in New York, about the Rothko coming up for auction. From the director of the literacy foundation I funded, updating me on the new programs. That Nancy Wilson was in constant demand. This one, the basement Nancy, might as well have been furniture. The irony was that I could buy my way back into their lives with a single revelation. One bank statement, one phone call to my attorney, one glimpse of the woman I really was beneath this careful camouflage. But what would that prove? That money mattered more than memory? That my worth was measured in dollars rather than the decades I'd spent loving them? No. If I was going to reclaim my place in this family, it wouldn't be through revealing my assets. It would be by revealing their assumptions. The stairs creaked again. This time, the footsteps were lighter, hesitant. Emma appeared at the bottom, clutching a plate covered in plastic wrap. Her dark hair was styled in an elaborate braid that Eleanor had probably arranged, turning my granddaughter into a miniature version of the ideal family member. She looked uncomfortable, glancing back up the stairs as if checking for permission. "Grandma, Mom said to bring you this." She held out the plate like an offering. Through the plastic, I could see a modest portion of everything. A slice of ham, some green beans, a scoop of mashed potatoes. The kind of plate you'd fix for someone you were obligated to feed but didn't expect to eat much. I smiled at Emma, the real smile I saved for moments when pretense wasn't necessary. "That's very kind of you, sweetheart. Would you like to sit for a minute?" She glanced upstairs again, then perched on the edge of a plastic storage container. In the harsh overhead light, I could see Rebecca in her face, the same determined chin, the same watchful eyes. But there was something else there, too. A curiosity that hadn't been trained out of her yet. "Why are you down here, Grandma?" Such a simple question, such a complicated answer. I considered my options. The polite deflection. The comfortable lie. The partial truth. Instead, I asked a question of my own. "Where do you think I should be?" She frowned, really thinking about it. "Upstairs, with everyone else. It's Christmas." "Yes," I agreed. "It is." We sat in silence for a moment. Above us, Eleanor's voice rose in some story that required dramatic gestures. I could picture her holding court, diamonds catching the light, everyone arranged around her like planets orbiting the sun. She had won this round, had successfully relegated me to the basement. But wars weren't won in single battles, and I had been fighting longer than she knew. "Grandma Eleanor says you get confused sometimes," Emma said suddenly. "That's why it's better for you to have quiet space." Ah, so the narrative had already been passed to the next generation. Poor, confused Grandma Nancy, better kept at a distance for her own good. I felt something shift inside me, a tectonic plate sliding into a new position. Patience was a virtue, but sometimes virtue looked too much like surrender. "Emma," I said, carefully, "what do you know about me?" She looked puzzled. "You're Grandma Nancy. You live in the small apartment. You make good cookies. What else?" The silence stretched. She fidgeted with the edge of her velvet dress, another Eleanor selection. "You were married to Grandpa Gerald?" "Yes. What else?" More silence. In 10 years of life, this child had absorbed almost nothing about who I was beyond my relationship to others. I was Grandpa's wife, Rebecca's mother, the grandmother who lived in reduced circumstances, the relative who slept in basements, a series of roles defined by diminishment. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "Would you like to?" Something in my voice must have caught her attention. She looked at me directly for the first time, really looked, as if trying to see past the costume to whatever lay beneath. "Okay." I leaned forward, speaking quietly enough that she had to lean in too. "I used to run board meetings with 30 executives who were afraid of me. I once negotiated a deal that saved 1,000 jobs. I speak 4 languages. I've traveled to 43 countries. I own paintings so beautiful they make people cry. I've written checks that built schools and fed families and changed lives. I am not now, nor have I ever been, confused." Her eyes widened. "Really?" "Really." "Then why?" She gestured at the basement, at the cot, at the utility sink, at all of it. "Because sometimes, sweetheart, people see what they expect to see. And sometimes, we let them. Until we don't." Footsteps on the stairs again, heavier this time. Rebecca's voice, with that edge of controlled panic she got when things weren't going according to plan. "Emma? Emma, where did you—" "Oh." She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, taking in the scene, her daughter sitting with me like a conspirator. "Dinner's getting cold. Come back upstairs." Emma stood obediently but paused. "Can Grandma?" "Come too." "Grandma's already eaten," Rebecca said smoothly. "Haven't you, Mom?" I held up the plate Emma had brought. "Just finishing up." "Good. Come on, Emma. Grandma Eleanor is looking for you." Of course she was. Emma started up the stairs, then turned back. "Grandma Nancy, will you tell me more stories later?" "If you'd like," I said. Rebecca's jaw tightened. "We'll see. It's going to be a busy night." They disappeared up the stairs, leaving me with my covered plate and my thoughts. I peeled back the plastic wrap and regarded the meal. It was exactly what I'd expected. Portions measured for politeness rather than generosity. Everything separate, nothing touching, as if even the food should maintain proper boundaries. I ate slowly, thinking about Emma's face when I'd told her the truth. That spark of recognition, of possibility. She was young enough to still see clearly, before the cataracts of assumption clouded her vision. If I could reach her, perhaps I could begin to unravel the story they'd all agreed upon. The story where I was a burden rather than a builder. Where I was confused rather than calculating. Where I deserved basements rather than boardrooms. The green beans were overcooked, the way Eleanor preferred them. Soft enough for old teeth, she'd probably said, as if my teeth hadn't been expensively maintained by the best dentists money could quietly buy. Everything on this plate had been prepared for someone else's idea of what I needed. Just like this cot. Just like this basement. Just like the entire framework of my current existence. But frameworks could be dismantled. Stories could be rewritten. And patience, I was learning, had its limits. The sound of chairs scraping overhead suggested dinner was ending. Soon, they'd move to the living room for coffee and dessert. Eleanor would hold court from the best chair, Tom would pour expensive whiskey for the men. Rebecca would flutter between kitchen and living room, making sure everyone had what they needed. Except for me, of course. I had what I needed. A basement, cot, and a utility sink, and the knowledge that I was exactly where they wanted me. For now. I finished the meal and set the plate aside. From my bag, I pulled out the small leather journal I'd been keeping. Not a diary exactly. More like a ledger, a careful accounting of every slight, every dismissal, every moment when I'd been erased from my own family's story. Not for revenge, I wasn't that petty, but for clarity. For the moment when I would need to explain not just what I had, but why. I had hidden it. The entries went back 3 years. Small things at first. Rebecca forgetting to invite me to Sophia's piano recital. Tom changing the subject whenever I offered financial advice. Eleanor's first suggestion that I might be happier in a community with people my own age. Each entry meticulously dated, carefully described, emotionally neutral. Evidence, really. Building a case for a trial that hadn't started yet. Tonight's entry would be simple. December 23rd. Assigned to basement for Christmas. Dinner delivered separately. Emma asking questions. That last part was new. Unexpected. A variable I hadn't calculated into my patient equations. Children had a way of disrupting carefully laid plans, of asking questions adults had learned not to voice. If Emma kept asking, others might start wondering. And wonder was all I needed. Just a crack in their certainty where truth could start, seeping in. My phone buzzed. The old one. The prop phone. A text from Rebecca. Mom, we're doing family photos in an hour. Maybe just come up for 1 or 2? 1 or 2. Not the formal portrait where I belonged, but a token inclusion. Enough to avoid questions from anyone who might notice my absence. Not enough to disrupt the image of the family they wanted to present. I texted back a simple, okay, an hour. Enough time to transform myself from basement Nancy to photo Nancy. To pin my hair a little neater, to apply the drugstore lipstick that suggested I was trying despite my circumstances. To practice the vacant smile that would let me fade into the background of their perfect Christmas tableau. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was Emma's questions. Maybe it was 3 years of accumulated silence. Maybe it was the simple fact that they'd finally put me in an actual basement, the metaphor made literal in a way that even I found darkly amusing. Whatever it was, I felt a shift in my internal compass. True north was no longer pointing toward patience. I stood, joints protesting after too long on the inadequate cot. The basement ceiling was low enough that I could touch it without stretching. Above me, my family lived their lives in rooms with crown molding and cathedral ceilings. The contrast wasn't lost on me. They had given me the literal lowest place in their home, the foundation that nobody thought about until something went wrong. But foundations were funny things. They held everything up. And when they shifted, everything above them moved too. I thought about the letter sitting in my safety deposit box. The one I'd written and rewritten a dozen times but never sent. The one that began, "By the time you read this, you'll have questions." The one that laid out not just the fortune I'd accumulated, but the reasons I'd hidden it. The careful documentation of how they'd pushed me to the margins of my own life. The explanation that money wasn't love, but respect was non-negotiable. I wasn't ready to send it, not yet. But for the first time, I could imagine a world where I might be. The wooden stairs had developed a squeak in the 3rd step from the bottom. I noticed it every time someone descended, a small warning system that gave me time to arrange my face into whatever expression the moment required. Grateful, Nancy. Confused Nancy. Tired Nancy. Harmless Nancy. I had a whole repertoire of Nancys, none of them real, all of them believed. The real Nancy was the one who had turned Gerald's modest portfolio into an empire. The one who had sat in boardrooms full of men who underestimated her and walked out with everything she wanted. the one who had raised 3 children while simultaneously building a fortune they knew nothing about. That Nancy was dangerous. That Nancy was done being stored in basements. But she was also smart enough to know that revelation required timing. That truth without strategy was just noise. That the most effective rebellions were the ones nobody saw coming. So I would go upstairs for photos. I would stand where they placed me. I would smile the empty smile they expected. I would play basement, Nancy for one more night. But tomorrow was Christmas Eve. The house would fill with witnesses, and Emma would want to hear more stories. Stories had a way of spreading, especially when told to children who hadn't yet learned what they weren't supposed to know. Stories about grandmothers who were more than they seemed, about fortunes hidden in plain sight, about the price of assuming that quiet meant weak. They thought they had buried me in this basement. They didn't realize they had planted me instead. And tomorrow, I would begin to grow. The camera flash illuminated the living room in harsh white bursts, freezing moments that would later be cropped and filtered into the illusion of familial harmony. I stood where Rebecca had positioned me, behind the couch where Tom's parents sat like visiting royalty, slightly to the left of center where the shadows would naturally obscure my face. Peripheral. Forgettable. Exactly where they wanted me. "Mom, maybe step back just a little more," Rebecca murmured, adjusting my position with gentle hands that felt more like a director moving a prop than a daughter embracing her mother. "Perfect. That's perfect." Eleanor smiled with practiced elegance, her diamonds catching the photographer's lights like tiny suns. She had insisted on hiring a professional for these photos, not trusting phone cameras to capture what she called the proper essence of the occasion. What she meant was that she wanted images worthy of the Christmas cards she'd send to her charity board friends, proof that her son had married into exactly the kind of family that reflected well on her social standing. The photographer, a young woman with purple hair and patient eyes, worked efficiently through the requested combinations. The whole family. The nuclear family without me. Tom's parents with their grandchildren. Rebecca with her children. Tom with his parents. Each grouping carefully choreographed to tell a story where I was increasingly optional. When the photographer suggested including me in more shots, Eleanor's voice carried that particular authority that came from writing large checks. "I think we have enough variety now, don't we? We wouldn't want to overwhelm poor Nancy. All this flash and posing must be quite tiring for her." Poor Nancy. The phrase had become my unofficial title in this house. Poor Nancy, who couldn't handle too much excitement. Poor Nancy, who needed simple meals and quiet spaces. Poor Nancy, who should be grateful for whatever corner of the family portrait they carved out for her. I smiled at the photographer and nodded as if agreeing with Eleanor's assessment, playing my role with the expertise of 3 years' practice. "Actually," Emma said suddenly, "can we do one with just me and Grandma Nancy?" The request hung in the air like a discordant note in an otherwise perfectly orchestrated symphony. Rebecca's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Eleanor's eyebrows rose just enough to suggest mild surprise. Tom cleared his throat the way he did when someone had committed a social miscalculation. "Sweetheart," Rebecca began, "we've already taken so many pictures. Maybe next time?" But Emma had inherited the family stubbornness, the same trait that had allowed me to build a fortune and Rebecca to succeed in corporate law. She crossed her arms and planted her feet. "Please? Just one picture with my grandma?" The photographer looked between us, professional instincts clearly telling her to capture whatever authentic moment was unfolding. I could see her finger, hovering over the shutter button, ready to preserve whatever truth might emerge from this unexpected crack in the evening's careful facade. "Of course," I said, extending my hand to Emma. "I'd be honored." We moved together to the fireplace, where the light was warmest. Emma leaned against me naturally, the way children do when they haven't yet learned to calculate the value of their affection. I felt the solid weight of her small body, the trust in the way she curved into my side. When had I stopped being someone my grandchildren sought out for comfort? When had I become someone they were taught to handle with careful distance? The camera captured the moment, and I found myself wondering what the photograph would show. Whether it would reveal the woman I used to be, glimpsed through the genuine smile I gave Emma. Whether it would document the precise moment when something shifted in the careful architecture of our family dynamics. Whether future historians would mark this as the beginning of the end of my voluntary exile. After the photographer packed up her equipment and left with promises to have the images ready by New Year's, the house settled into its evening rhythm. Tom retreated to his study. With a glass of whiskey and a medical journal, Eleanor and Richard claimed the living room, discussing their upcoming cruise to Alaska with the kind of detailed planning that made it clear this was their domain now. Sophia disappeared to her room with her phone. Brandon vanished into the basement family room to play video games on the big-screen television that had been installed since my last visit. Rebecca moved through the house like a conductor managing an orchestra, ensuring everyone had what they needed, that coffee was fresh, that the guest towels were properly arranged. I watched her from my position on the kitchen stool where I'd perched to stay out of the way, marveling at how efficiently she managed to be essential to everyone except herself. She had learned the art of serving so thoroughly that she'd forgotten she was allowed to be served in return. "Mom, you should probably get some rest," she said eventually, appearing beside me with that careful smile that meant she was managing my schedule again. "Tomorrow's going to be a big day. Christmas Eve, the day when the house would fill with extended family and friends, when the performance of Perfect Suburban Christmas would reach its crescendo. The day when I would be expected to make brief appearances, to accept hugs and small gifts from people who barely remembered my name, to be grateful for the privilege of observing their celebrations from whatever corner I was assigned." "Actually," I said, "I thought I might stay up a little longer, maybe help with some of the preparation for tomorrow." The offer seemed to confuse her. She blinked several times, as if translating my words from a foreign language. "Oh, that's sweet of you to offer, but everything's already taken care of. Eleanor's caterer is handling most of it, and I've got the rest under control." Of course they did. When had I become someone whose help was no longer wanted? When had my decades of hosting holiday dinners, of orchestrating family gatherings, of creating the very traditions they now celebrated without me, been deemed irrelevant? I nodded and smiled as if her rejection didn't slice through something soft and unguarded in my chest. "Well then, perhaps I'll just sit with Eleanor and Richard for a bit. I so rarely get to hear about their travels." Rebecca's smile became more forced. "They're pretty tired from their trip down here. Maybe it's better to let them relax." Every suggestion I made was met with a gentle deflection, a careful redirection that painted my desire to participate as potentially disruptive to the delicate balance they'd achieved. I was being managed again, shepherded toward the basement where I could be safely contained until needed for the next photo opportunity or obligatory meal. Instead of arguing, I stood and kissed Rebecca's cheek. "You're right, of course. I am tired. Thank you for such a lovely evening." She relaxed visibly, clearly relieved that I was cooperating with the script. "Sleep well, Mom. We'll see you in the morning." I descended the stairs to my basement corner, each step taking me further from the warmth and light above. But instead of the defeat I'd felt earlier, I found myself experiencing something else entirely. Clarity. The kind that comes when all the pieces of a puzzle suddenly rearrange themselves into a recognizable picture. They didn't want me to help with Christmas Eve preparations because they'd already decided what role I would play. The grateful recipient, the elderly relative who should be pleased to be included at all. The woman who had been moved so far to the margins that her opinions no longer mattered, her contributions no longer valued, her presence barely tolerated. But what they didn't understand was that margins were where I'd learned to operate. Margins were where women of my generation had always done their most important work. in the spaces between official recognition and actual power, in the gap between what people saw and what was really happening, in the silence that everyone mistook for absence. I pulled out my phone, the real one this time. Not the theatrical flip phone I carried for Rebecca's benefit, but the iPhone that connected me to the life I'd built in shadow. 43 missed calls, 67 unread messages, a fortune that had grown by $2 million in the 3 days since I'd last checked, a world that ran on my decisions even when I was relegated to basements. The first message was from David Chen, my financial advisor. Nancy, the Singapore deal closed early. We're up 12% for the quarter. Call when you can. David was the only person who still called me Nancy without qualifiers. Not poor Nancy, or tired Nancy, or confused Nancy. Just Nancy, the woman who'd built a portfolio that made him one of the most successful advisors on the East Coast. The second was from Maria Santos, the director of the women's shelter I'd funded anonymously for the past 5 years. The new wing is opening ahead of schedule. The women wanted me to thank their guardian angel, whoever she is. Guardian angel. If only they knew their guardian angel was sitting on a cot in a basement, surrounded by Christmas decorations and forgotten like a seasonal item no longer in fashion. The third was from James Morrison, the gallery owner in Soho who'd been trying to convince me to let him display my art collection publicly. Nancy, I know you value your privacy, but these pieces deserve to be seen. The Monet alone could anchor an entire exhibition. He'd been persistent for 2 years now, unable to understand why someone would own museum-quality art only to keep it in climate-controlled storage where no one could appreciate it. I scrolled through the other messages. Updates on real estate, acquisitions, charitable donations that had changed lives, investment opportunities that would generate millions more, an entire universe of activity and influence and impact, all of it flowing from decisions I made in stolen moments when no one was watching. All of it invisible to the family upstairs who saw only the costume I wore, the role I performed, the diminished version of myself I'd allowed them to believe was real. The irony was almost amusing. While they debated whether I was capable of helping with party preparations, I was generating more wealth in passive income than their combined annual salaries. While they worried about my confusion and decline, I was funding scholarships and homeless shelters and medical research. While they managed my limitations, I was managing millions. But the amusement faded quickly, replaced by something harder and more complicated. Anger, yes, but also sadness. Grief for the relationships that had been sacrificed on the altar of their assumptions. Loss for the woman I'd been in their eyes, the mother and grandmother who had been capable and valued and seen. A soft knock on the basement door interrupted my brooding. Too light to be Rebecca, too hesitant to be Tom. "Come in," I called, quickly switching back to the prop phone and sliding it into view while pocketing the real one. Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed in pink pajamas with her hair in a messy braid. She looked around carefully, as if checking for adults who might send her back to bed, then descended slowly. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Can I sit with you for a minute?" "Of course, sweetheart." She settled onto the storage container again, pulling her knees up to her chest. In the harsh basement lighting, she looked younger than her 8 years, vulnerable in the way children are when they're processing information too complex for their experience. "Grandma Nancy? Those things you told me earlier, about the paintings, and the languages and stuff, were they true?" Such a simple question, such a dangerous answer. I could lie, maintain the fiction, protect her from the complicated truth about what her family had done to me. Or I could trust her with reality, knowing that children were often the worst secret keepers in the world. That whatever I told her might reach her parents' ears within hours. "Why do you ask?" She shrugged, picking at a loose thread on her pajama sleeve. "Mom and Grandma Eleanor were talking about you after you went to bed. Mom said you've been having trouble remembering things, but you seem to remember everything just fine to me. Ah, so the narrative was being reinforced even when I wasn't there to hear it. The story of poor, confused Nancy was being told and retold until it became accepted truth, until even my own granddaughter was taught to question my mental capacity, rather than their treatment of me. What else did they say? Emma's face scrunched in concentration. Grandma Eleanor said it was sad when old people start living in the past. She said that's why you tell stories about things that couldn't really happen. Because you get mixed up about what's real and what you just wish was real. The psychological assassination was complete. Not only had they erased my actual capabilities, they'd reframed my truth-telling as delusion. If I claimed to have run board meetings, it was confusion. If I mentioned owning valuable art, it was wishful thinking. If I demonstrated knowledge of languages or travel or business, it was an old woman living in fantasies because reality had become too small to bear. It was brilliant, really. A perfect trap. The more I protested their characterization, the more confused I would seem. The more I insisted on my competence, the more they could point to my defensiveness as proof of decline. They'd created a narrative where my only acceptable responses were grateful acceptance or increasing isolation. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed I cared more about their approval than I did about the truth. "Emma," I said, meeting her eyes directly, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am not confused. I do not live in the past. Everything I told you earlier is true. And if your mother and grandmother choose to believe otherwise, that says more about them than it does about me." Her eyes widened. No adult had ever spoken to her with such directness about family dynamics. Children were supposed to be protected from these complications, kept innocent of the power struggles and psychological warfare that adults waged against each other with smiles and careful words. But why would they think you're confused if you're not? "Because," I said carefully, "sometimes people find it easier to believe we're broken than to admit they haven't been paying enough attention to see who we really are." She considered this with the seriousness children brought to information that challenged their understanding of the world. "So you really did those things? The paintings and the meeting with scared men and the countries?" "All of it, and more." "Can you prove it?" There it was, the question I'd been both dreading and hoping for. The moment when I could choose to maintain the comfortable lie or risk everything on the gamble that truth might matter more than peace. That love might be worth more than the careful balance they'd achieved at my expense. I reached for my real phone, then stopped. Not yet. If I was going to reveal myself, it wouldn't be in a basement corner at midnight to a child who shouldn't have to carry adult secrets. If I was going to reclaim my place in this family, it would be when they were all listening, when the stakes were high enough to make the revelation matter. "Not tonight," I said, "but soon. Very soon." Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. Children were better at accepting mysteries than adults were. They hadn't yet learned that everything needed to be explained immediately, categorized, and filed away in neat psychological boxes. "Will you tell me more stories tomorrow?" she asked. "If you want to hear them." "I do. I really, really do." She hugged me then, fierce and sudden, before disappearing back up the stairs as quietly as she'd come. I listened to her footsteps padding across the floor above, back to her room where she would lie awake thinking about grandmothers who were more complicated than anyone had told her. About families that weren't quite what they seemed. About the difference between what people said and what was true. I sat in the silence that followed, feeling something shift deep in my chest. The patient resignation that had carried me through 3 years of diminishment was finally giving way to something more dangerous. Not anger exactly, not revenge, but a kind of crystalline determination that felt both familiar and long forgotten. I was tired of being managed, tired of being marginalized, tired of pretending that their version of me was acceptable when it bore no resemblance to the woman I actually was. Most of all, I was tired of protecting them from the consequences of their own assumptions. Tomorrow would bring Christmas Eve, with its crowd of witnesses and its carefully orchestrated celebrations. Eleanor would hold court in her role as matriarch, dispensing approval and disappointment with equal measure. Rebecca would exhaust herself trying to please everyone while pleasing no one completely. Tom would retreat into his medical journals and whiskey, avoiding the emotional labor his wife carried alone. And I would sit in whatever corner they assigned me, smile at whatever scraps of attention they offered, and accept whatever role they'd written for me in the family mythology: the grateful grandmother, the declining widow, the woman who used to matter but didn't anymore. Or I wouldn't. The choice was mine. Had always been mine. I'd just forgotten that for a while. Forgotten that power wasn't something other people gave you, but something you claimed for yourself. Forgotten that respect wasn't earned through silence but through the strategic use of your voice. I thought about the letter in my safety deposit box, the one that began, "By the time you read this, you'll have questions." Maybe it was time to add another paragraph. Maybe it was time to set a date for delivery. Maybe it was time to stop being Basement Nancy and start being the woman who had never needed their approval to know her own worth. The foundation of their comfortable assumptions was about to develop some cracks, and when foundations shifted, everything built on top of them had to find new ways to stand. I smiled in the darkness, the first genuine smile I'd worn in this house. Tomorrow would be very interesting indeed. Christmas Eve morning arrived with the sound of activity erupting above my head like a percussion symphony. Caterers banging through the kitchen door at 7:30. Eleanor's voice directing traffic with military precision. Rebecca's heels clicking frantically across hardwood floors as she orchestrated what she called our annual celebration, but what felt more like a theatrical production designed to impress an audience that would judge every detail. I lay on the narrow cot, listening to my family prepare for a party that would happen around me rather than with me. The basement had grown cold overnight, the kind of deep chill that seeped through concrete and settled in your bones. No one had thought to adjust the heating down here. Why would they? Storage areas didn't need to be comfortable. My phone buzzed against the makeshift nightstand. A text from Rebecca, sent from upstairs rather than delivered in person. "Mom, the house will be chaotic today. Maybe stay downstairs until guests arrive? I'll bring coffee and breakfast." Even her consideration came wrapped in exile, care disguised as banishment. I typed back a simple, "Of course, dear," and set the phone aside. But instead of the obedient compliance she expected, I stood and began to dress with deliberate intention. Not in the discount store polyester that had become my uniform, but in the silk blouse I'd hidden in the bottom of my bag. The one that had cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. I'd kept it for occasions that required a different version of myself, and today felt like such an occasion. The mirror in the utility area reflected back a woman I hadn't seen in months. Still gray-haired, still lined with age, but standing straighter. Eyes clearer, presence more solid. I applied makeup with steady hands, not the trembling uncertainty of an old woman, but the practiced efficiency of someone who had once commanded boardrooms full of men who underestimated her. 20 minutes later, I climbed the stairs and entered a kitchen transformed into mission control for holiday perfection. 3 caterers moved with choreographed precision around granite counters laden with ingredients for dishes I used to make, from memory. Rebecca stood at the center wearing an apron over designer clothes, directing operations while simultaneously checking her phone and sipping coffee from a mug that read, "World's Best Mom." She looked up when I appeared, and I watched confusion flicker across her face. Something was different about me this morning, though she couldn't quite identify what. The posture, perhaps. The way I occupied space instead of apologizing for taking it up. The silk blouse that caught the light in ways that polyester never could. "Mom, I was just about to bring you breakfast," she said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "You look nice. Are you feeling all right?" Was I feeling all right? The question that had replaced "how are you" in our conversations, as if my emotional state was now primarily a medical concern rather than a human one, as if wellness was something that happened to me rather than something I actively maintained. "I'm feeling excellent," I replied, pouring myself coffee from the expensive machine that Tom had imported from Italy. "What can I do to help?" The caterers exchanged glances. Rebecca's smile tightened in that way that meant she was calculating how to redirect my energy without hurting my feelings. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of commercial-grade refrigeration and the distant sound of Eleanor's voice offering instructions about flower arrangements. "That's so sweet of you to offer," Rebecca began, using the same tone she'd employed when the children were small and wanted to help with tasks beyond their capabilities. "But everything's really under control. Maybe you could just supervise? Make sure we're doing things the way you would." Supervise. A consolation prize for the woman who had once orchestrated charity galas for 300 guests. A token role for the mother who had taught her daughter everything she knew about entertaining. I was being offered the chance to watch other people execute skills I had developed over decades, like a retired athlete invited to observe the sport they once dominated. "Actually," I said, setting down my coffee with deliberate care, "I think I'll go speak with Eleanor about the seating arrangements. She mentioned yesterday that she was still working out some of the details." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. In the 3 years since Gerald's death, I had never voluntarily sought out Eleanor's company. Our interactions had been polite but minimal, civil but distant. I'd learned early that Eleanor viewed me as competition for influence in her son's household, and I'd chosen to withdraw rather than fight for territory that seemed less and less worth defending. But withdrawal, I was learning, could be mistaken for defeat, and I was no longer interested in being defeated. I found Eleanor in the formal dining room, arranging place cards with the precision of a chess grandmaster planning an attack. She wore a burgundy cashmere ensemble that probably cost more than most people's rent. Her silver hair styled into a helmet of propriety that wouldn't dare shift even in a hurricane. She looked up when I entered, surprise flickering across features trained to reveal nothing unintentional. "Nancy," she said, the greeting containing just enough warmth to avoid rudeness, but not enough to suggest actual pleasure at my presence. "You're looking energetic this morning." Energetic. Another medical assessment disguised as observation, as if vitality in a woman my age was suspicious rather than natural, as if aging meant I should apologize for every moment I didn't appear to be declining. "I wanted to discuss the seating for tonight," I said, approaching the table where she'd laid out a detailed chart. Names written in careful calligraphy, each placement calculated to facilitate conversation and demonstrate status. "I noticed you've put me next to your sister Margaret." Eleanor's hand paused over the cards. Margaret was 91, nearly deaf, and prone to lengthy monologues about her late husband's military service. Placing me beside her ensured I would spend the evening nodding politely at stories I couldn't hear while being unable to participate in any meaningful conversation with other guests. "I thought you'd enjoy catching up with her," Eleanor said smoothly. "You two have so much in common." What we had in common was age and widowhood, as if those characteristics defined our entire capacity for social interaction. As if years of experience in the world had narrowed our interests to a single shared frequency of irrelevance. I was thinking I might be more useful near the center of the table, I said. "Perhaps between Dr. Harrison and that young couple from Tom's hospital." Rebecca mentioned their new parents, and I remember how overwhelming those early years can be. Eleanor's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. She wasn't accustomed to having her decisions questioned, especially not by someone she'd successfully marginalized for years. The dining room suddenly felt smaller, the air thick with tension that had been building for far longer than this single conversation. "I'm sure you do remember," she said, her voice carrying the kind of sweetness that preceded poison. Though sometimes our memories of those times become rosier than they actually were. It's natural at our age to romanticize the past. Our age. She was 76 to my 73, but she wielded those 3 years like a scepter of authority. As if experience was measured solely in calendar pages rather than the depth and breadth of life actually lived. As if her comfortable widowhood in a house maintained by her children made her more qualified to judge reality than my decades of financial independence and active engagement with the world. "My memory is quite clear, thank you," I replied, maintaining the same level tone I'd once used in business negotiations. "In fact, I was thinking we might benefit from fresh perspectives at the table. Sometimes we get so settled in our patterns that we forget to make space for new conversations." She studied me with the focused attention of a scientist examining an unexpected mutation. Something had shifted in our dynamic, something she couldn't quite categorize or control. The Nancy Wilson she'd been managing for 3 years wouldn't have questioned seating arrangements, wouldn't have advocated for better placement, wouldn't have suggested that their patterns might need adjustment. "Of course," she said finally, though her smile had developed sharp edges. "I'll certainly take your suggestions under consideration." Under consideration. The phrase that meant absolutely nothing would change, but my concerns had been officially acknowledged and could therefore be officially dismissed. I nodded as if accepting her non-commitment, but something inside me noted the moment with the kind of precision I'd once applied to tracking market fluctuations. Eleanor had just revealed that she saw me as a threat worth managing rather than a presence worth dismissing. The front door chimed, signaling the arrival of the first wave of guests. From the kitchen came the sound of Rebecca's voice rising in greeting, the bright artificial cheerfulness that meant showtime had begun. Eleanor smoothed her skirt and checked her reflection in the dining room mirror, preparing to assume her role as gracious matriarch of a family gathering she'd largely orchestrated to showcase her own importance. "We should go greet our guests," she said, the possessive pronoun making it clear that these were her guests in her son's house at her carefully planned celebration. I was an invited observer, permitted to attend but not to participate in any meaningful way. Instead of following her lead, I remained at the dining room table, studying the seating chart with renewed interest. The careful calculations of status and influence, the strategic placement of allies and potential troublemakers, the way certain people were positioned to shine while others were consigned to social Siberia. It was masterfully done, really, a display of power that looked like hospitality. But there was something Eleanor didn't know, something none of them knew. While they'd been busy managing my decline and adjusting their expectations downward, I'd been carefully documenting every slight, every dismissal, every moment when I'd been treated as less than I was. Not for revenge, but for clarity. For the day when I might need to explain not just what had happened, but why it mattered. That day was approaching faster than any of them realized. The living room filled with voices as guests arrived in waves. Tom's colleagues from the hospital, impressive in their professional confidence. Rebecca's friends from the country club, immaculate in their holiday finest. Neighbors who'd known our family for years, carrying casserole dishes and wine bottles and the comfortable assumption that everything was exactly as it appeared. I positioned myself near the kitchen doorway where I could observe without being expected to engage. It was a strategic choice, the kind of invisible vantage point I'd learned to occupy when I wanted to understand the real dynamics of a room rather than the performed version. From here, I could watch how people moved around each other, who deferred to whom, where the actual power flowed beneath the surface of social pleasantries. Eleanor held court near the fireplace, accepting compliments on her decorations and the Meal preparations with the grace of someone accustomed to admiration. Tom played the proud host, discussing medical innovations with colleagues while maintaining the perfect balance of professional authority and personal warmth. Rebecca fluttered between groups, ensuring everyone had drinks and conversation partners, managing the social mechanics with the efficiency of a conductor leading a complex symphony, and I watched from the shadows, as invisible as I'd been trained to be, but no longer accepting invisibility as my permanent condition. Dr. Harrison, the cardiac surgeon who would be sitting at Eleanor's right hand during dinner, approached with a warm smile and a question about my health that managed to be both concerned and condescending. "Nancy, you're looking well. How are you managing? Rebecca mentioned you've had some challenges with adjustment since Gerald passed." Challenges with adjustment. Another euphemism for the story they'd all agreed upon. That I was struggling, declining, unable to cope with the realities of aging and loss. That my reduced circumstances were evidence of reduced capacity rather than reduced patience for their assumptions. "I'm managing beautifully, thank you," I replied, meeting his gaze directly. In fact, I've never felt more clear about what matters most. Something in my tone must have caught his attention, because he studied me with the kind of clinical observation that doctors applied to symptoms they couldn't immediately diagnose. "That's wonderful to hear. Sometimes these transitions can be difficult to navigate alone. Alone. There it was again, the assumption that widowhood had rendered me helpless. That without Gerald's presence, I was adrift in a world too complex for my diminished understanding. None of them had ever asked what resources I possessed for navigating life independently. They'd simply assumed that resources required a man's name on the account. "I've never been alone," I said calmly. "I've simply been underestimated." Dr. Harrison blinked, clearly unsure how to respond to a statement that didn't fit the narrative he'd been given about Nancy Wilson, the confused widow who needed careful management. Before he could formulate a response, Rebecca appeared at my elbow with that practiced smile that meant she was about to perform another rescue operation. "Mom, let me introduce you to the Washingtons. They're new to the neighborhood, and I thought you might enjoy meeting them." More managing, more careful redirection away from conversations that might challenge the established order. But instead of allowing myself to be guided away, I turned to include Dr. Harrison in the introduction. "Doctor, have you met Tom and Sarah Washington? They've just moved here from Chicago, and I believe they're both in medical fields." The conversation that followed revealed that Dr. Washington was an oncologist and his wife a pediatric nurse. Both were accomplished professionals with fascinating perspectives on healthcare innovation. Both were intelligent, articulate people who might have made excellent dinner companions if Eleanor hadn't already assigned me to sit next to her nearly deaf sister. As we talked, I found myself remembering what it felt like to engage with people as equals, rather than accepting the role of elderly relative who needed protection from stimulating conversation. Dr. Washington asked thoughtful questions about my experiences living in the area. His wife shared stories about their children's adjustment to the move. Nobody mentioned my age or health or the challenges of transition. Nobody spoke to me as if I were fragile. It was refreshing in a way that made me realize how thirsty I'd become for simple human respect. Eleanor appeared beside us with the timing of someone who'd been monitoring the conversation from across the room. "Nancy, dear, I hate to interrupt, but Margaret has been asking for you. She's so looking forward to catching up during dinner." The intervention was smoothly executed, socially flawless, and completely transparent in its intent. I was being extracted from a conversation where I might appear too competent, too engaged, too much like the woman I actually was rather than the woman they needed me to be. "Of course," I said, smiling at the Washingtons. "It was lovely meeting you both. I hope we can continue our conversation later." As I walked away, I heard Dr. Washington say to his wife, "What an interesting woman. Rebecca's mother seems remarkably sharp for someone her age." For someone her age. Even admiration came wrapped in the assumption that mental acuity was surprising, rather than expected. That intelligence in a 73-year-old woman was notable rather than normal. But at least he'd noticed. At least someone had seen past the costume to the person underneath. Margaret sat in the corner chair that had been designated as mine for pre-dinner conversation. Her hearing aid turned up so high that it produced a thin whistle whenever she moved her head. She grabbed my hand with surprising strength when I approached, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement that came from having a captive audience for stories she'd told countless times before. "Nancy, how lovely to see you again. I was just telling Eleanor about Harold's medals from the war. Did I ever tell you about the time he saved his entire unit in the Battle of the Bulge?" She had, in fact, told me this story at least 6 times over the years. But I settled into the chair beside her and prepared to listen again, because Margaret was lonely, and stories were sometimes the only way elderly people could hold on to their sense of relevance in a world that had moved on without them. But as she began the familiar tale, I found myself thinking about my own stories, the ones I'd never told, the board meetings where I'd been the only woman in the room and the smartest person at the table, the investment decisions that had generated millions in wealth, the charitable work that had changed lives, the art I'd collected, the languages I'd mastered, the countries I'd visited as something more than a tourist. Those stories deserved to be told too, deserved to be heard by grandchildren who might be inspired by them, deserved to be acknowledged by a family that had forgotten their own history in their rush to manage what they perceived as my decline. Margaret was in the middle of describing Harold's heroic actions when Emma appeared at my elbow, her face flushed with excitement from running through the house full of adults. "Grandma Nancy, can you help me with something upstairs?" Before I could respond, Eleanor's voice cut through the room with surgical precision. "Emma, dear, don't bother your grandmother. She's having a nice conversation with Margaret." But Emma had inherited more than just the family's stubbornness. She'd also inherited the ability to recognize when adults were being less than truthful. She looked between Margaret, who was still talking to herself about battles fought decades ago, and me, who was clearly not engaged in anything resembling conversation. "It's okay," Emma said with the confidence of someone who'd already made up her mind. "I really need Grandma Nancy's help. It's important." Something in her tone suggested this wasn't about untangled shoelaces or lost toys. I excused myself from Margaret, who barely noticed my departure, and followed Emma through the crowd of guests toward the stairs. As we passed the dining room, I caught sight of the seating chart Eleanor had refused to modify. My name still positioned, next to Margaret's, far from any conversation that might prove challenging or interesting. But seating charts, like so many other things, could be changed. The evening was far from over, and I was just beginning to remember what it felt like to stop accepting other people's definitions of my place in the world. Emma led me up the stairs with the kind of urgency that suggested she'd been planning this moment for hours. Whatever she wanted to show me, whatever questions she'd been saving up, I had the feeling that my careful balance between truth and performance was about to become much more complicated. And for the first time in years, I was looking forward to the complication. Copy Publish Emma's bedroom was a shrine to childhood dreams, all pink walls and fairy lights and stuffed animals arranged with the kind of careful precision that only 8-year-olds could achieve. But she barely glanced at her treasures as she pulled me inside and closed the door with the solemnity of someone conducting serious business. Her hands were shaking slightly, and I could see the war between excitement and fear playing across her features. "Grandma Nancy," she whispered, even though we were alone, "I need to show you something, but you have to promise not to tell Mom or Dad or anyone else. Not yet." The request sent alarm bells through my grandmother instincts, but something in her expression told me this wasn't about broken rules or childhood mischief. This was about trust, the kind that could only be built through honesty, even when honesty was complicated. "What is it, sweetheart?" She reached under her bed and pulled out a tablet, the expensive kind that her parents monitored carefully and restricted to educational apps and approved entertainment. But Emma had apparently learned more about technology than anyone realized. because the screen that came to life was displaying a web browser with multiple tabs open. "I've been researching you," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "After you told me those stories, I wanted to see if they were real. And Grandma, Nancy, they are. They're all real." My heart stopped. Actually stopped. The way hearts do when the world tilts on its axis, and everything you thought was stable suddenly shifts into new configurations. On the tablet screen were newspaper articles, business journals, charity foundation websites, art auction records. A digital treasure trove of documentation about a life I'd kept hidden for 3 years. The first article was from the Wall Street Journal, dated 4 years earlier. Wilson Foundation announces $50 million commitment to women's education. The accompanying photo showed me at a podium, looking nothing like the diminished woman my family saw now. Professional, confident, completely in command of a room full of influential donors. Emma swiped to the next tab, a Forbes article about successful female investors, with a small sidebar about Nancy Wilson, the private portfolio manager who's generated consistent returns by betting against market trends. Another photo, this one from a gallery opening where I stood beside a Picasso sketch I'd just acquired for my private collection. "There's so much more," Emma said, her voice filled with wonder and confusion in equal measure. "Articles about companies you've saved, schools you've built, art you've bought. Grandma Nancy, you're like famous, rich famous. Why didn't anyone tell me?" I sat heavily on her bed, surrounded by stuffed unicorns and evidence of a life I'd worked so hard to conceal. The careful architecture of deception I'd built was crumbling in real time, brought down by an 8-year-old with a tablet and much curiosity for her own good. "Because," I said slowly, "I didn't want them to know." "But why?" The question came out as a wail of genuine distress. "Why would you want people to think you're poor when you're not? Why would you let them put you in the basement when you could buy this whole house?" Such simple questions, such impossible answers. How do you explain to a child that sometimes love needs to be tested? That sometimes the only way to know if people value you is to take away everything else they might value instead? That sometimes you make yourself small to see if anyone will notice you're disappearing? "Emma, have you ever felt invisible?" She shook her head, but something in her expression suggested she was trying to understand a concept that lived just outside her. "Experience. Sometimes," I continued, "when people only see what you can give them instead of who you are, you start to wonder if they love you or just love what you provide. Your grandfather's money, your grandmother's connections, your mother's help. If you take all that away, what's left?" "You're left," she said simply. "Just you." "Yes. But what if just you isn't enough for them anymore?" Emma's face scrunched in concentration as she processed this adult complexity. On the tablet screen, another article had loaded automatically. This one from a medical journal, acknowledging my anonymous donation that had funded a new pediatric wing at Children's Hospital across the country. The donation had been made 6 months ago, while I was living in the garage apartment and clipping grocery store coupons for Rebecca's benefit. "They treat you like you're nobody," Emma said finally, "but you're somebody. You're somebody really important." "Important to who?" "To lots of people. Look." She swiped through tab after tab, showing me documentation of a legacy I'd been building in shadow while my family managed my supposed decline. Scholarship recipients whose lives had been changed by grants they didn't know came from me. Small businesses that had survived because of investments I'd made through shell companies. Entire communities that had been revitalized by foundations I'd funded anonymously. I was somebody to hundreds of people I'd never met. Somebody who mattered to women who'd returned to school because of scholarships I'd provided. Somebody who'd saved jobs and funded research and preserved art for future generations. The only people who didn't see me as somebody were the ones who shared my DNA. "Emma," I said carefully, What are you planning to do with this information? Her chin jutted out in the stubborn expression I recognized from Rebecca at the same age. I'm going to tell everyone. Tonight. At dinner. I'm going to show them these articles and make them apologize for being mean to you. The impulse was pure and fierce and completely impractical. I could imagine the chaos that would result from Emma's 8-year-old version of justice. The accusations, the defensive justifications, the way my revelation would be framed as manipulation rather than truth. Eleanor would find a way to make me the villain of the story. Rebecca would feel betrayed by my deception. Tom would calculate the financial implications and wonder what I might want from them now that my secret was exposed. Sweetheart, I appreciate your loyalty more than you could possibly know, but there might be a better way to handle this. What way? I looked at the tablet screen, at the evidence of a life lived on my own terms while pretending to live on theirs. At the proof that I hadn't been confused or declining or any of the things they'd decided I was. At the documentation of worth that had nothing to do with their approval and everything to do with choices I'd made when no one was watching. Trust me, I said, and when the moment is right, you'll know. Emma studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Promise you won't let them keep treating you like you don't matter? I promise. She hugged the tablet to her chest like a shield. Can I keep researching? There might be more stuff? You can keep researching. But Emma? This stays between us until I say otherwise. Can you do that? She nodded solemnly, and I knew she would keep her word. Children were natural secret keepers when the secrets felt important enough, when they understood that adult complications sometimes required careful timing rather than immediate action. We went back downstairs together, Emma clutching her tablet, and me carrying the weight of exposure that felt both terrifying and liberating. The party had reached its full crescendo while we were upstairs, the living room packed with guests who moved through conversations with the practiced ease of people who belonged in the same social circles, who shared assumptions about success and status and the natural order of families. Rebecca was deep in conversation with Dr. Harrison near the fireplace, both of them laughing at something he'd said. She looked happy, relaxed in a way I rarely saw anymore. The successful lawyer, the perfect hostess, the devoted daughter managing all the details of her complicated life with impressive competence. I felt a stab of something that might have been guilt, watching her in her element and knowing I was about to disrupt it in ways she couldn't anticipate. Eleanor stood near the dining room entrance, monitoring the crowd with the satisfaction of a general surveying a successful campaign. Her seating chart remained unchanged on the side table, my name still positioned next to Margaret's, far from any conversation that might challenge or interest me. She caught my eye and smiled with the kind of beneficent approval that meant I was behaving exactly as expected. Tom approached with a glass of wine and what looked like a genuine attempt at conversation. Nancy, I've been meaning to ask how you're finding your new apartment. Is it working out for you? Such a careful question, designed to express interest without suggesting that he might be willing to offer alternatives, polite enough to demonstrate concern, distant enough to avoid responsibility. The kind of question that allowed him to check the box of family duty without risking actual engagement with whatever complications my answer might contain. It's fine, I replied, matching his tone of pleasant detachment. Very convenient. Good, good. Rebecca worries, you know. She wants to make sure you're comfortable. Rebecca worries. Another way of shifting responsibility while claiming credit for caring. Rebecca worried, but Tom was the one asking the questions. Rebecca worried, but Eleanor was the one making the seating decisions. Rebecca worried, but somehow the worry never translated into actions that might address the actual problems instead of managing their symptoms. Rebecca is very thoughtful, I agreed, watching her across the room as she gestured animatedly in conversation with people who saw her as an equal rather than a burden to be carefully handled. The dinner bell chimed. Eleanor's signal that the evening's main performance was ready to begin. Guests began migrating toward the dining room with the practiced movement of people accustomed to formal entertaining. I followed at an appropriate distance, maintaining my position in the social hierarchy that had been carefully established over years of subtle choreography. The dining room looked like something from a magazine spread. Crystal glasses catching candlelight, silver reflecting, warm flames, flowers arranged with professional precision. Eleanor had outdone herself, creating an atmosphere of elegant abundance that would photograph beautifully and be remembered fondly by everyone who participated in it. I found my assigned seat between Margaret and the wall, far enough from the center of the table that I could observe without being expected to contribute meaningfully to the conversation. Margaret was already seated, her hearing aid producing its telltale whistle as she adjusted it for maximum volume. She smiled when she saw me, clearly delighted to have a guaranteed audience for another evening of Harold's wartime heroics. But, as I moved toward my chair, I noticed something unexpected. Emma was sitting directly across from me, positioned where she could maintain eye contact throughout the meal. She'd been assigned to the children's table in the kitchen, but somehow she'd managed to get herself promoted to the adult dining room. Her tablet sat discreetly beside her plate, dark but present. Eleanor stood at the head of the table. Wine. Glass raised for the traditional toast that would officially begin the evening's festivities. The room quieted respectfully, all attention focused on the woman who had orchestrated this gathering and expected appropriate gratitude for her efforts. "Friends, family, welcome to our home," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "We're so grateful to share this Christmas Eve with all of you. Family is the foundation of everything meaningful in life, and tonight we celebrate the bonds that connect us across generations." Bonds that connect us across generations. I almost smiled at the irony. The bonds that had once connected me to this family had been systematically severed over the past 3 years, cut away piece by piece until I was tethered to them by obligation rather than love, duty rather than desire. Eleanor continued her toast, talking about tradition and gratitude, and the importance of cherishing the time we had together. All beautiful sentiments that would have been meaningful if they'd been accompanied by actions that demonstrated actual cherishing. If the woman delivering them hadn't spent the evening ensuring I was positioned as far from meaningful interaction as possible. "To family," she concluded, raising her glass higher. "To family," the room echoed, crystal chiming against crystal in a symphony of celebration. I raised my glass and drank the toast, tasting expensive wine and expensive hypocrisy in equal measure. Across the table, Emma watched me with eyes that seemed too old for her face, too knowing for someone who should have been focused on the excitement of staying up past bedtime for a fancy dinner. The meal began with the kind of polite conversation that filled elegant dining rooms across the country. Professional accomplishments, travel plans, observations about the unusually mild winter weather. I listened from my corner position, contributing, occasional murmurs of agreement when Margaret paused in her monologue long enough to require acknowledgement. But I was also watching, observing the dynamics that played out over multiple courses. The way Eleanor controlled conversational flow by asking strategic questions and changing subjects when discussions didn't serve her purposes. The way Tom deferred to his parents while maintaining his authority over his own household. The way Rebecca worked harder than anyone else to ensure everyone felt included, while never quite achieving inclusion herself. It was during the main course that things began to shift. Dr. Washington, the oncologist I'd spoken with earlier, was describing a new treatment protocol when he mentioned the challenges of funding innovative research. "It's frustrating," he said, "when you know treatments could save lives, but the money simply isn't available for proper trials." Eleanor nodded sympathetically. "Such important work. If only there were more philanthropists willing to support medical research instead of vanity projects." "Actually," Dr. Washington replied, "there are some remarkable anonymous donors making significant contributions. We received a substantial grant last year from someone who clearly understood the potential impact of early intervention protocols. Whoever it was didn't want recognition, just results. I felt Emma's eyes on me from across the table. She knew about the medical grants, had seen the documentation of research funding I'd provided to 3 different cancer centers over the past 2 years. I met her gaze and gave the slightest shake of my head. Not yet. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I noticed Emma becoming increasingly restless as the evening progressed. She picked at her food, checked her tablet discreetly, and watched me with the kind of intensity that suggested she was building toward something. By the time dessert was served, she was practically vibrating with suppressed energy. Eleanor was in the middle of describing her upcoming cruise when Emma suddenly spoke up, her voice carrying clearly across the dining room. "Grandma Eleanor, why did you put Grandma Nancy next to Margaret?" The question landed in the elegant conversation like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of confusion and discomfort. Eleanor's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained steady. "I thought they'd enjoy each other's company, sweetheart. They have a lot in common." "Like what?" The challenge in Emma's voice was unmistakable now. Rebecca looked alarmed, Tom confused, Eleanor carefully controlled. This wasn't the kind of conversation that belonged at formal dinner parties, but Emma had apparently decided that politeness was less important than truth. "Well," Eleanor said, clearly calculating her response, "they're both in similar stages of life." "You mean they're both old?" "Emma," Rebecca warned, "that's not appropriate dinner conversation." But Emma was beyond caring about appropriate. She was staring at Eleanor with the kind of direct gaze that made adults uncomfortable, the piercing attention of someone who refused to accept euphemisms for reality. "I think Grandma Nancy should sit with interesting people," Emma continued. "She knows about lots of stuff. Did you know she speaks 4 languages?" Eleanor's laugh sounded forced. "I'm sure your grandmother has many wonderful stories, dear. Sometimes when we're older, we remember things more vividly than they actually happened." There it was, the dismissal I'd been expecting, the gentle but definitive categorization of my experiences as the fantasies of an aging mind. Eleanor had just given Emma exactly the opening she'd been waiting for. "Actually," Emma said, pulling out her tablet with the ceremonial flourish of someone revealing evidence in a trial, "I can prove that Grandma Nancy's stories are true. All of them." The dining room went silent, except for the whisper of fabric, as people shifted in their chairs and the distant sound of classical music playing from hidden speakers. Every face turned toward Emma, who suddenly looked very young and very determined in the candlelight. "Emma, put that away," Rebecca said, her voice sharp with embarrassment. "This isn't the time or place for—" "Mom, just look," Emma interrupted, standing up and walking around the table to where her mother sat. "Look at this." She held out the tablet, and I watched Rebecca's face change as she read whatever was displayed on the screen. Confusion gave way to disbelief, then to something that might have been recognition, then to a complexity of emotions I couldn't fully decode from across the table. "What is it?" Tom asked, reaching for the tablet. Emma began to read aloud, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room. "Nancy Wilson, private investor and philanthropist, announced today the establishment of the Wilson Foundation for Women's Education, with an initial commitment of $50 million to support women returning to college after raising families." She swiped to another article. "Wilson Portfolio Management, led by Nancy Wilson, has consistently outperformed market indices for the past 15 years through a strategy of long-term value investing and careful risk assessment." Another swipe. "Anonymous donor funds new pediatric wing at Children's Hospital. While the donor's identity remains confidential, hospital administrators confirm the gift represents the largest single contribution in the institution's history." Emma looked up from the tablet, her eyes bright with triumph and vindication. There's lots more. Articles about art she's bought, companies she's saved, schools she's built. Grandma Nancy isn't confused. She's famous. The silence that followed was different from the polite quiet that had preceded Emma's revelation. This was the silence of people recalculating everything they thought they knew, adjusting their understanding of reality to accommodate information that didn't fit their existing frameworks. Eleanor was the first to speak, her voice carefully, controlled but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. Nancy, surely there's been some mistake. These articles must be about someone else with the same name. All eyes turned to me. I could feel the weight of their attention, the sudden shift in the room's emotional gravity. This was the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating for 3 years. The moment when I would either reclaim my place in this family or confirm that I'd never really had one to begin with. I stood slowly, my movements deliberate and unhurried. The silk blouse caught the candlelight, and I realized that everyone was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Not poor Nancy or confused Nancy or declining Nancy. Just Nancy. The woman who had built an empire while they thought she was building casseroles. There's no mistake, I said quietly. Every word is true. Rebecca's face had gone pale. Mom, I don't understand. If you have all this money, why are you living in that apartment? Why did you sell the house? Why didn't you tell us? Such good questions, such complicated answers. I looked around the table at faces that reflected confusion, embarrassment, calculation, and in Emma's case, fierce pride. These people who had spent 3 years managing my decline were suddenly faced with evidence that I'd been managing them instead. I needed to know, I said simply, if you loved me or just what I could provide. The statement hung in the air, like a challenge that no one quite knew how to meet. Tom was staring at the tablet screen, probably calculating numbers. Eleanor looked like she was reviewing 3 years of interactions through a completely different lens. Rebecca appeared to be processing the implications of every conversation we'd had about my finances, every assumption she'd made about my limitations. But Mom, Rebecca said finally, we do love you. We've been trying to take care of you. No, I replied gently. You've been trying to manage me. There's a difference. I gestured toward my seat in the corner, next to Margaret, who was still talking quietly to herself about wartime rationing. You've spent 3 years treating me like a burden to be handled rather than a person to be valued. You've put me in basements and garage apartments and corners of dining rooms because you decided I was no longer capable of occupying the center of my own life. Eleanor's voice carried a defensive edge when she spoke. We were concerned about your well-being. After Gerald died, you seemed fragile. I seemed grief-stricken, I corrected. There's a difference between mourning and declining. But instead of supporting me through loss, you decided I was incompetent and needed to be managed like a child. Rebecca's eyes were bright with tears now. We didn't mean... We thought we were helping. You thought you were helping yourselves, I said, not unkindly, but with the clarity that comes from 3 years of careful observation. Helping yourselves feel better about not really seeing me, about not asking what I needed or wanted or was capable of, about making assumptions based on my age and widowhood rather than actually knowing who I am. The dining room had become a confessional. The elegant dinner party transformed into a reckoning none of them had seen coming. Around the table, guests who had come for holiday celebration were witnessing the implosion of a family's comfortable mythology. Tom cleared his throat, clearly struggling to process the financial implications. Nancy, I have to ask. The estate planning, the inheritance issues we discussed. If you have significant assets, there are legal considerations. And there it was. Within minutes of learning the truth, he was already calculating how my wealth might affect their financial future, not asking why I'd hidden it or how they might repair the relationship damage, just trying to understand how the new information impacted their own interests. "Tom," I said calmly, "I have more money than your family could spend in 3 generations. I own properties in 4 states, art worth millions, and investment portfolios that generate more income in a month than you make in a year. I've been funding charities, building schools, and changing lives while you've been worrying about whether I could handle my own checkbook." The numbers seemed to stun him into silence. Around the table, other guests were beginning to murmur among themselves, realizing they were witnessing something more dramatic than a typical family disagreement. Eleanor's voice carried a new tone when she spoke, something sharper and more calculating than her usual social polish. "Well, this certainly changes things, doesn't it? I suppose you'll be wanting different arrangements going forward." Different arrangements. Even now, she was focused on managing the situation rather than acknowledging the harm that had been done. Even now, she was positioning herself as the wronged party rather than the architect of my exile. "The only arrangement I want," I said, looking directly at Rebecca, "is to be treated like the competent adult I've always been, like someone whose opinions matter and whose presence is valued rather than tolerated." Rebecca was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as the full weight of the evening's revelations settled over her. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I thought—" "You thought what you wanted to think," I finished gently. "What was easier to believe than the truth?" Emma had been silent during this exchange, but now she spoke up with the moral clarity that children sometimes possessed. "Are you going to stop sleeping in the basement now?" The question was so simple, so direct, that it cut through all the adult complexity and euphemism to the heart of what had been happening. An 8-year-old had articulated what no one else had been willing to say outright, that they had literally relegated me to the basement of their lives. "Yes," I said, smiling at her. "I think my basement days are over." I looked around the table one final time at the faces that showed varying degrees of shock, embarrassment, calculation, and in some cases, shame. The performance was finished. The revelation was complete. Whatever happened next would happen, between people who finally knew the truth about each other. "I'll be going now," I announced, placing my napkin beside my plate with the same care I'd used for everything else during my years of pretending to be less than I was. "Emma, thank you for your research and your courage. Rebecca, we'll talk when you're ready. Eleanor, thank you for the lovely evening." I walked through the dining room toward the front door, past guests who were still processing what they'd witnessed, past the family who were still calculating what it meant. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody asked where I was going or whether I needed help getting there. In the foyer, I collected my coat from the closet where it had been hanging next to minks and cashmeres worth more than most cars. My modest cloth coat looked out of place among the expensive garments, just as I had looked out of place in my assigned role as the family's charity case. But as I opened the front door and stepped into the crisp December night, I realized something had fundamentally changed. I was no longer out of place because I was no longer pretending to be someone I wasn't. I was no longer playing a role written by people who had forgotten how to see me. I was Nancy Wilson, investor, philanthropist, art collector, world traveler, builder of schools, and changer of lives. I was a woman who had turned grief into purpose and silence into strategy. I was someone who mattered to hundreds of people, even if I'd stopped mattering to the handful who shared my DNA. The night air was cold but clean, sharp with the promise of snow and new beginnings. Behind me, the house glowed with warm light and the sound of voices trying to make sense of what had just happened. Ahead of me stretched possibilities I'd forgotten I possessed. Tomorrow, I would start making different choices. Tomorrow, I would stop hiding my light under the bushel of other people's expectations. Tomorrow, I would begin living as the woman I'd always been instead of the woman they'd needed me to be. But tonight, I would drive to my house in Lake Geneva, The one nobody knew about. The one where I could take up space without apology. I would sleep in a bed that didn't creak, in a room with windows instead of concrete walls, in a home where I was the center of my own story instead of a footnote in someone else's. The basement days were over. Everything else was just beginning. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my Lake Geneva house, morning sunlight streaming through windows that faced the water instead of concrete walls. The coffee was French, roast from a local roastery that knew my name and preferences. The newspaper was spread across granite countertops that had never known the indignity of utility sinks or industrial cleaning supplies. This was what home looked like when you stopped apologizing for taking up space in your own life. The guest bedroom had been converted into a proper art studio, with north-facing windows and professional lighting that made my watercolors glow, like stained glass. 3 mornings a week, I taught painting classes here to women who came not because they needed charity, but because they wanted to learn from someone who understood that creativity didn't have expiration dates. We drank wine while we painted, laughed while we made mistakes, and nobody worried about whether we were too old to start something new. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria Santos at the women's shelter. New Mothers program launching next. Week. Thought you'd want to know your investment is changing lives daily. She still didn't know I was her anonymous benefactor, but she'd learned to trust that whoever was funding their programs understood the work in ways that went beyond mere financial support. I'd visited the shelter twice in the past month, ostensibly as a volunteer, actually as someone who needed to see the tangible results of money well spent. The morning routine had become sacred to me. Coffee first, then emails from the investment firm that managed my public portfolio. David Chen had finally convinced me to let him handle more aggressive growth strategies, now that I was no longer pretending to be poor. The returns were impressive, but more importantly, the work felt aligned with who I actually was instead of who I'd been performing. After breakfast, I'd walk down to the lake and sit on the dock that came with the house. I'd bought for privacy and kept for peace. The water changed color with the weather and the season, sometimes blue as Mediterranean skies, sometimes gray as old pewter, always moving in ways that reminded me that stagnation was a choice rather than inevitability. I'd spent 3 years standing still while everyone around me made decisions about my life. Now I moved with the deliberate purpose of someone making up for lost time. The art collection had come out of storage. Real paintings hung on walls where they could be seen and appreciated instead of preserved in climate-controlled darkness. The Monet sketches were in the living room, conversation pieces that sparked discussions about beauty and investment and the way art could outlive the people who created it. James Morrison from the Soho Gallery had been right about public exhibitions, but I'd chosen a different path. Private showings for small groups, intimate gatherings where art was experienced rather than merely viewed. Rebecca called every Sunday. Now, conversations that lasted longer than the obligatory check-ins of previous years. She was seeing a therapist, working through what she called the guilt and the grief of not really knowing my own mother. The process was painful for both of us, unpacking 3 years of assumptions and missed connections, but it felt necessary in ways that surface politeness never had. Last month, she'd asked if she could bring the children for a weekend, not to visit poor Grandma Nancy, but to see the woman who owned paintings and built schools and spoke 4 languages. "I want them to know who you really are," she'd said. And I'd cried after hanging up because someone finally wanted to know who I really was instead of who they needed me to be. Tom had been more difficult to forgive. His immediate calculations about inheritance and estate planning revealing priorities that cut deeper than Eleanor's social manipulations. But he'd surprised me by showing up unannounced 3 weeks ago, standing on my front porch with the kind of vulnerability that doctors rarely displayed. He'd apologized not just for the basement, but for the years of treating me like a medical problem instead of a person. We'd talked for hours, and while trust would take time to rebuild, respect had been reestablished on more honest foundations. Eleanor, predictably, had never contacted me directly. But I'd heard through Rebecca that she'd been telling people at the country club about her remarkable daughter-in-law's mother, the philanthropist who prefers to keep a low profile. The narrative had shifted from poor, confused Nancy to fascinatingly mysterious Nancy, which was progress of a sort. Eleanor understood power, even when she didn't understand the person wielding it. The biggest change was Emma. She visited every other weekend now, sleeping in the guest room that had been decorated specifically for her, with bookshelves full of stories about strong women and windows that looked out over water instead of concrete. She'd appointed herself my official biographer, filling notebooks with stories I told her about board meetings and art auctions and the countries I'd visited before she was born. Last weekend, she'd asked if I would teach her French, and we'd spent Saturday morning conjugating verbs while painting watercolor landscapes. "I want to be like you when I grow up," she'd announced over lunch, and I'd told her she could be herself instead, which was infinitely more interesting than being like anyone else. But I understood what she meant. She wanted to be someone who didn't apologize for taking up space. Someone who built things that mattered. Someone who spoke her truth, even when it complicated other people's comfortable assumptions. The foundation work had expanded beyond anonymous donations to active involvement. I served on 3 boards now, participating in strategy meetings and funding decisions with the kind of engagement I'd been missing during my years of voluntary invisibility. Other board members treated me as a peer, someone whose opinion mattered and whose expertise was valued. The contrast with family dinners where I'd been managed like a declining asset was stark enough to be almost funny, if it hadn't been so painful. Dr. Washington and his wife had become unexpected friends, the kind of relationship that develops when people see you clearly from the beginning instead of having to adjust their vision later. They'd invited me to dinner parties where I was introduced as Nancy Wilson, the investor and philanthropist, rather than Rebecca's mother, who used to have some difficulties. We talked about books and travel and medical innovations, conversations that challenged and energized me in ways I'd forgotten were possible. The most profound change was internal. I'd stopped performing versions of myself for other people's comfort. The careful costume of thrift store polyester had been donated to actual charity, replaced by clothes that fit both my body and my life. The flip phone had been retired in favor of technology that supported rather than disguised my capabilities. The apologetic posture had been replaced by the stance of someone who belonged wherever she chose to stand. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own judgment about people and situations, instead of deferring to family members who claimed to know what was best for me. When the local hospital board approached me about serving as chairwoman for their capital campaign, I said yes without consulting anyone about whether it might be too much for someone my age. When a documentary filmmaker wanted to interview me about women in finance, I agreed without worrying about whether the attention might seem inappropriate for a widow who should be quietly grateful for whatever attention she received. The documentary had aired last month, 45 minutes about women who'd succeeded in male-dominated fields despite systemic barriers and cultural expectations. I'd talked about the board meetings where I'd been the only woman, the investment, strategies that men had dismissed until they proved profitable, the way expertise could be invisible when it came from unexpected sources. The filmmaker had been particularly interested in my 3-year experiment in voluntary poverty, calling it a fascinating case study in how family dynamics can obscure individual agency. Rebecca had watched the documentary and called afterward, crying again as she processed the realization that she hadn't really known her own mother despite 43 years of shared history. "I saw you in that boardroom footage," she'd said, "and you looked so confident, so competent. I don't know when I stopped seeing that version of you." We'd talked about grief and assumption and the way people could become invisible even to those who loved them most. The phone rang, interrupting my morning reflection. Emma's voice bubbled through the speaker with the kind of excitement that meant she'd discovered something new about the world. "Grandma Nancy, I found another article about you. This one's about a school you built in Guatemala. Did you learn anything interesting? I asked, smiling at her enthusiasm for research that would have bored most children her age. I learned that you went there to see it yourself. There's a picture of you with the students, and you look really happy. Happier than in the family pictures from Christmas. Such perceptive observations from someone so young. She was right, of course. In the Guatemala photograph, I was surrounded by children whose education I'd funded, standing in a classroom that wouldn't have existed without my investment. My smile in that image was genuine in ways that family photos had rarely captured in recent years. I was happy, I confirmed. I was doing something that mattered. You matter too, though. Not just the things you do. You. Children had a way of cutting through complexity to reach truth that adults spent years avoiding. Emma understood something that her parents were still learning, that I had value beyond my utility, worth beyond my willingness to serve other people's needs. Are you coming this weekend? I asked. Mom said yes. And she said maybe next time she could come too and you could show her your paintings. The real ones, not just pictures on the internet. Progress. Slow, careful progress built on honesty, instead of assumption. Rebecca was ready to see the art collection, to understand the woman who had been quietly building a legacy while everyone thought she was declining into irrelevance. It would be awkward at first, all of us adjusting to new roles and revised expectations, but awkwardness was preferable to the comfortable deception we'd maintained for 3 years. After Emma hung up, I sat in the sunshine, streaming through my kitchen windows and thought about the basement where this story had begun, the narrow cot between the water heater and Christmas decorations, the utility sink where I'd been expected to wash my face, the concrete walls that had literally contained my presence in my own family's home. It seemed impossible now that I'd accepted such treatment, that I'd played along with their narrative of my diminishment for so long. But the basement had served a purpose beyond humiliation. It had been a laboratory where I'd tested the limits of love and discovered the difference between being valued and being managed. It had been a mirror that reflected back not my own failures, but their inability to see past surface appearances to the woman underneath. Most importantly, it had been a catalyst that finally pushed me past patience into action. The letter I'd written but never sent was still in my safety deposit box. 47 pages of careful documentation about every slight, every dismissal, every moment when I'd been treated as less than I was. I'd kept it as evidence, as insurance, as proof, that I hadn't imagined the systematic erosion of my place in the family, but I no longer needed it. The truth had been spoken. The relationships had been reset. The future was being built on more honest foundations. I thought about the women in my painting classes, many of them wrestling with their own versions of invisibility. Widows who'd been defined by their husbands' achievements, mothers who'd disappeared into their children's needs, professionals who'd been sidelined by ageism and assumptions about declining capabilities. We painted together, and in the process, we became visible to each other in ways that family members sometimes failed to manage. The lake was calm this morning, reflecting sky and clouds with perfect clarity. I could see boats in the distance, moving with purpose toward destinations I couldn't identify but could appreciate. Movement was good, direction was better, but most important was the freedom to choose your own course instead of accepting whatever dock others assigned you. Tonight, I would have dinner with Dr. Washington and his wife, conversation that challenged and energized me. Tomorrow I would attend a board meeting where my opinion mattered and my expertise was valued. This weekend, Emma would visit and we would paint watercolors while speaking French and talking about the difference between being somebody and being somebody's somebody. The basement was behind me now, literally and metaphorically. What lay ahead was the rest of my life, lived on my own terms with the full force of my capabilities engaged. I was 73 years old, wealthy beyond most people's imagination, And finally, free to be exactly who I'd always been underneath the costumes and performances. Nancy Wilson. Not poor Nancy, or confused Nancy, or declining Nancy. Just Nancy. The woman who had built an empire while everyone thought she was building casseroles. The woman who had survived being buried in a basement and emerged ready to reclaim the sky. The foundation had been tested and found solid. Now it was time to build something beautiful on top of it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.